I've always trusted my dog more than I trust my own instincts. Animals sense things we don't always pick up on. That's why, when Shadow started barking in my bedroom closet that night, a deep, primal fear settled into my gut. At first, I ignored it. Dogs bark all the time, at shadows, at wind, at their own reflections. But Shadow wasn't just barking. He was growling, his body stiff, his ears pinned back. His tail, normally wagging, was motionless, hanging low between his legs. It wasn't just noise. It was warning. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around my phone. I was alone in the house. My parents were out of town for the weekend, and I was supposed to enjoy a quiet night, binge-watching my favorite shows. But now, standing in the dim light of my bedroom, my dog growling at a closet I hadn't touched all day, I didn't feel like watching anything. "Shadow," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's nothing there, buddy." He didn't budge. My stomach twisted. Every horror movie I'd ever seen told me not to open that door. But I had to. I took a slow step forward, my heart hammering so hard I swore it echoed through the room. My fingers curled around the cold brass handle of the closet door. I hesitated, exhaled shakily, and yanked it open. Nothing. Just my clothes hanging limply from the rod. A few old shoes on the floor. The same cluttered mess it had always been. I let out a breath and turned to Shadow with a nervous laugh. "See? Nothing." Then I saw them. Tiny, wet footprints. They started inside the closet and led out onto my carpet, out towards my bed, and then they disappeared under it. I stopped breathing. The air in the room felt suddenly dense, pressing against my chest, squeezing my lungs. My mind raced to come up with something. Anything that made sense. Maybe I'd stepped in something earlier. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them before. But no, they were fresh. The dampness still darkened the carpet, and the footprints were too small, too human. Shadow let out a low whimper, stepping back toward the door. He didn't want to be in here anymore, and suddenly neither did I. I forced my legs to move, inching toward the bed, my breath shallow, my ears strained for any sound. A rustle, a whisper, a breath. Nothing. I crouched down, heart thundering, and lifted the bed skirt with trembling fingers. Darkness, and then a breath. Hot, damp, right in my face. Not mine. A sharp, ice-cold hand grabbed my wrist. I gasped, jerking back, but the grip was impossibly strong. Small fingers, too small, clamped around me, the skin clammy and wet. And then it pulled. I screamed, kicking against the floor, my nails clawing at the carpet. Shadow barked wildly, but I was slipping, my shoulder vanishing under the bed. The grip tightened. A sharp, burning pain shot up my arm as nails dug into my skin. I thrashed harder, yanking with everything I had. And just when I thought I was going to be dragged into whatever was waiting under there, the grip let go. I scrambled back, gasping, my body shaking violently. Shadow was snarling now, teeth bared, his body stiff with fury. I didn't look under the bed again. I didn't need to. I ran. I grabbed Shadow and bolted out of my room, down the stairs, out the front door, and into the cold night. I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's house. I pounded on their door until they answered, and when they did, I barely managed to stammer out what had happened. They let me stay the night. The next morning, I went back with my neighbor. Everything was as I left it. My bed, my closet, my phone lying on the floor where I must have dropped it in my panic. But the footprints were gone, and under my bed, only my old storage bins, my extra blankets, nothing else. Nothing except for 4 long scratches in the carpet, right where I had been pulled, as if someone had been dragged back into the darkness. I never slept in that room again. And Shadow? He never stopped watching that closet, even long after I moved out. The CU.
The whispering closet. Lena had always been drawn to old, abandoned places. When she first moved into her new apartment, an old, weathered building tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, she felt a strange sense of comfort. And then there was the closet. The closet was massive, too large for a single person's wardrobe, with dark, intricate carvings etched into the wood, worn by time. It stood at the far end of her bedroom, its thick brass handles glinting ominously in the low light. The first time Lena noticed it, she shrugged it off as just another quirky detail of the apartment. On the first night after unpacking, Lena sat in bed reading, the quiet hum of the city outside the only sound filling the room. But then she heard it, a faint rustling sound. She paused, the book held in front of her, eyes wide, listening. The sound stopped. She thought it was just the building settling. It was old after all. So she tried to dismiss it. But it didn't stop for a few nights. Lena tried to ignore it. But the whispers became clearer and their tone began to change. The voices began calling her name, softly at first, barely audible. Lena. Lena, she froze. It was impossible. She was alone. There was no one else in the apartment. She convinced herself it was all in her head, a product of her overactive imagination. But that night, the voices became louder, more desperate. Lena, open the door. We need you. Please. Open the door. One evening, unable to resist any longer, Lena walked toward the closet. The air around her felt thick, as though something was watching, waiting. With shaking hands, she grasped the brass handle. It was ice cold, like it had been frozen by something ancient, something beyond her understanding. She hesitated, but the whispers grew more frantic, pleading. They seemed so close, so real. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to open the door. At first, there was nothing, just a wall of darkness within the closet. But then her eyes adjusted. Lena gasped as her gaze fell on a single tattered dress hanging in the center of the closet. It swayed gently despite the stillness of the room. Lena stepped closer, unable to take her eyes off the strange, abandoned garment. And then it hit her. Beneath the dress there were footprints, faint, dusty prints leading to the spot where the dress hung. A chilling thought flashed through her mind. Who had worn that dress? Was there something, someone, hidden behind it? Before she could think another thought, the closet door slammed shut behind her. Lena spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. Something cold brushed her skin, a hand? She could feel it, cold as ice, grabbing her wrist, pulling her into the darkness. She screamed, but the sound was muffled by the thick walls of the closet. The whispers, those haunting whispers, rushed into her ears louder and louder, until they filled her mind, pushing her into a maddening frenzy. Please let me out, she thought desperately. But there was no answer. Suddenly, she was no longer alone. She wasn't in her room anymore. The dark space surrounding her stretched into an endless void. She tried to move, but her limbs were frozen, her body paralyzed. And then she saw them. Hundreds of faces, eyes wide open and filled with terror, staring back at her from the darkness. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. They were trapped, just like her, caught in this limbo, this world between the living and the dead. The next morning, her neighbors found her apartment empty, except for the closet, its door cracked slightly open. No sign of Lena remained. But at night, when the wind blew through the cracks in the walls, they could hear it, the soft, pleading whispers from the closet. And just once they swore they heard a new voice join in. Let me out, please. Days passed, but Lena's disappearance remained a mystery. The authorities came and went, and while the apartment was locked up tight, they found no trace of her, no struggle, nothing to explain where she had gone. The building's landlord, Mr. Finch, had no explanation either, and he seemed almost too eager to erase the incident from his memory. But something strange happened in the days that followed. The whispers returned. It began with Sarah, the tenant in the apartment next door. She had been hearing the faint voices, thinking it was just her imagination, or perhaps a neighboring tenant who was keeping strange hours. But one night, as she lay in bed, she realized that the whispers weren't just coming through the walls. They were coming from the closet. Terrified, she tried to ignore them. It was silly, she told herself. Just the old building settling. But then the whispers started to call her name. Sarah, Sarah, open the door. The words were chilling, filled with a desperation that felt too real to be ignored. Her gaze drifted toward her own bedroom closet. She could see the faint outline of the wooden door, but beyond that, nothing. The darkness was absolute. Get a grip, Sarah whispered to herself, standing up. Her hand shook as she reached for the door handle. Her breath caught in her throat. Suddenly she hesitated. Something about the closet felt wrong, as if it wasn't meant to be opened. But the whispers didn't care. They were louder now, frantic. Please, open the door, Sarah. Before she could think twice, Sarah opened the closet door. The air inside was icy, colder than the rest of the room, and a strange, musty smell wafted out. She recoiled, but her feet refused to move. Her eyes scanned the closet, but it was empty. No strange dress, no footprints, just the dark void beyond the shelves. Then, as if in response to her defiance, the closet door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the cold, dark space. She reached for the knob to open it again, but it wouldn't budge. The door felt heavier, as though something on the other side was holding it shut. Suddenly the whisper stopped. Silence. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was a silence that pressed against her, a suffocating void that seemed to crush the air from her lungs. And then the floor beneath her feet shifted. She felt a strange vibration, the walls seemed to pulse, and with each pulse, a low, guttural voice joined the whispers. "You're mine now." She froze in terror. And then the door to the closet flew open. But it wasn't her room that Sarah saw beyond the door. It was the same dark, empty void that Lena had once encountered. And within it, countless faces stared at her, their eyes wide with an agony so deep, it threatened to swallow her whole. The faces shifted, melting into one another, their mouths moving silently, but their eyes screamed for help. They reached toward her, their hands grasping through the darkness, pulling her closer. "You shouldn't have opened it," they whispered, their voices growing louder. As Sarah backed away, she could feel something tugging at her, pulling her toward the closet. She stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet, but no matter how far she moved, it felt as if the space was closing in on her. The faces grew closer. They stretched out, the walls of the closet narrowing, and soon, Sarah was no longer in her apartment. She was somewhere else, somewhere cold and desolate. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the softest whisper of all. Next days later, the apartment building stood empty. No tenants dared to stay there anymore. The landlord's promises to take care of things were empty words, and soon the building was abandoned, just like the others in the neighborhood.